The thing about search and rescue is that you spend most of your career finding people who are dead. Not all of them. Plenty of living ones, too. Disoriented hikers, diabetics who wandered from the trailhead, kids who got turned around chasing a squirrel and ended up 3 ridges over from their parents' camp. But when a missing persons case goes past 72 hours, the math changes, and every ranger working the search knows it, even if nobody says it out loud. You stop looking for a person, and you start looking for remains. That's the framework I was running in my head the morning I found Carla Freely. Let me know where you're watching from, and if you've ever had an encounter like this, drop it in the comments below. She had been missing for 15 years, 4 months, and 9 days. She was 19 when she disappeared. I found her the summer she would have turned 34. Before we get into it, let me know where you're watching from and if you've had an encounter like this. My name is Burkhart. I was a backcountry ranger with the Okanogan-Wenatchee National Forest for 16 years, the last 8 of which I worked out of the Entiat Ranger District, a stretch of the eastern Cascades in north-central Washington state that most people couldn't find on a map if you spotted them, the state, and the general direction. It's a good place to not be found. Steep country, mostly roadless above 4,000 feet, with drainages that run so deep and narrow, the sun only hits the creek bottoms for a few hours a day in midsummer. Ponderosa pine and larch down low, giving way to subalpine fir and Engelmann spruce higher up. Granite and schist and the occasional limestone band, old burns scattered through it, some of them from fires decades old, standing gray snags and blowdown that makes cross-country travel a kind of controlled misery. The Entiat Valley runs roughly north-south along the Entiat River before the river turns and empties into the Columbia. The valley itself sees some traffic, summer homes, a few orchards in the lower stretches. But the drainages that branch off it to the east and west are something else. Mad River, Crow Creek, Ramsey Creek, Ice Creek, coming down off the ridge toward Pyramid Mountain. Once you're a mile up any of those, you are genuinely alone in a way that's hard to explain to someone who hasn't spent time in that country. The cell coverage dies before you get to the first fork. The trails are marginal, some of them not maintained in 15 or 20 years, reclaimed by alder and slide debris. You can walk for 3 days without crossing a road or seeing another person. It's also the kind of country that swallows people. Not in a supernatural sense. I want to be careful about that, because that word gets attached to things it doesn't belong to, and the Entiat country is not supernatural. It's just real wilderness, the kind where a turned ankle 2 miles from the trailhead becomes a life-threatening situation if the weather turns. People get lost there in the straightforward way. They leave the trail to shortcut a switchback. They lose the route in a burn. They push too late into the afternoon and get caught in a creek drainage after dark. The Entiat River forks and reforks, and the tributaries look similar enough in low water that even experienced hikers have walked up the wrong one for miles before figuring it out. I should tell you a little about how I ended up in the Entiat District, because it matters to how I understood what happened. I came to rangering sideways, studied biology at Central Washington University in Ellensburg, spent 2 years doing fisheries work for the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, on the Methau, counting steelhead reds in water cold enough to make your hands stop working right after about 20 minutes. Then a seasonal position with the Forest Service in the Okanogan came open, then a permanent appointment, then a transfer to the Wenatchee. By the time I ended up in Entiat, I had about 8 years of backcountry experience, spread across 3 ranger districts, and a working knowledge of the eastern Cascades that I was, honestly, a little proud of. I knew the country. That pride is worth mentioning because of what it means when the country shows you something you didn't know was in it. The Entiat Ranger District covers roughly 400,000 acres, from the Columbia River bottomlands up through the high alpine zones of the Chelan Mountains and into the Entiat Mountains on the east side. The working ranger's territory, the country you actually get into on foot, is a fraction of that on paper and a very specific fraction in practice. The drainages with maintained trails, the campfire permit zones, the areas with wilderness permit requirements that generate the call logs and the incident reports. Past the end of the maintained trail network, past the last permit zone, the country largely takes care of itself. Nobody counts elk in there. Nobody does bird surveys. The Forest Service has maps of it, but the maps are mostly topographic with very little layered information. Old roads, old survey lines, land ownership boundaries. What's actually happening in those upper drainages in any given year? The fire history, the wildlife movement, the vegetation succession after a burn or a slide. That's not in any database. That's in the heads of rangers who've been walking it for 20 years, and most of them retire before they write anything down. I'm telling you this because it's relevant. The Crow Creek drainage above the 4-mile mark, the section where I found Carla's cache that morning in July of 2019, was in my working knowledge as a narrow, steep, under-traveled piece of terrain with marginal trail, some known cliff hazard in the upper sections, a spring-fed tributary at about 4.5 miles that held water even in drought years, and a small basin at the head of the drainage around 6,000 feet that old-timers in the district referred to as the Crow Basin, though that name doesn't appear on any current map I've seen. I had been up that trail 6 times in 8 years. I thought I knew what was in it. I didn't know what was in it. Carla Freely went missing on a Thursday in late August 2004. She was a nursing student at Wenatchee Valley College, living with her parents in the town of Entiat, which sits right at the mouth of the valley where the river meets the Columbia. She was an experienced hiker by regional standards. Grew up in that valley, knew the lower trails, had done overnight trips up Entiat Creek and into the upper country a handful of times with her family. She went out that Thursday for what her mother described as a day hike to Cow Creek Meadows, which is a popular enough destination, maybe 7 miles round trip from the trailhead, a route she'd done before. She left a note. She took water, snacks, her old REI day pack. She didn't take a map because she'd been there before and didn't think she needed one. She was supposed to be back by 6. By 8, her mother called the Chelan County Sheriff's Office. The search started the next morning and ran for 11 days. Forest Service, County SAR, State Patrol Air Support, volunteer teams from Wenatchee and Chelan. They worked Cow Creek, Anthem Creek, the adjacent drainages. They found her car at the trailhead, and they found her water bottle about a mile up Cow Creek, where the trail crosses the creek on a log bridge that was slippery that time of year. They found boot prints on the far side of the crossing that matched her shoes. Past that, nothing. No pack, no further prints they could positively attribute to her. No physical sign, no signal whistle, no response to calls. The terrain in that drainage has some cliff bands above the trail. There are spots where the walls come in tight and the ground above is loose, crumbly granite with glacial till on top of it. Searchers worked every one of those sections. They ran cadaver dogs twice. Nothing. After 11 days, the search wound down. The file stayed open, but resources redirected. Carla Freely joined the category of people who go into the backcountry and don't come out. A list that's longer in the North Cascades than most people know. The family kept a website active for years, updated around the anniversary of her disappearance, offering a reward that eventually reached $25,000. I saw the flyers at the ranger station when I transferred to the Entiat District in 2011, 7 years after she went missing. Her photo was still taped to the board inside the front door. High school photo, probably, from the look of it. Dark hair, a grin like she'd just gotten away with something. I thought about her sometimes when I was up in that country, not in a focused way, more the way you think about anyone who walked a trail you're walking, anyone who stood where you're standing and then wasn't anywhere anymore. One of the first things I did when I took the Entiat posting was pull the incident file on the 2004 search. I do this with every significant SAR case in my district, any missing person who was never found. It's a habit I developed early, reading the search documentation the way you'd read a terrain briefing before going into new country. The Freely file was thorough. The SAR coordinator, a Chelan County deputy named Gabe Lindquist, who had been doing mountain rescues in that valley for 15 years by the time Carla went missing, had run a tight operation. I read through the search sector assignments, the grid documentation, the cadaver dog handler notes. 11 days of organized searching that covered the logical terrain methodically. What struck me, reading it, was a notation on day 6. One of the hasty search teams had gone up a side drainage off Cow Creek, a steep unnamed gully on the eastern wall of the main canyon that wasn't on any trail system. They'd gone about 400 yards before the terrain became too hazardous to continue safely. Loose rock, an unstable cliff band above. The team leader had noted the sector as incomplete, flagged it for technical rope access if the search extended, but the search wound down 4 days later before the technical team went back in. That gully is roughly half a mile below and east of the section of trail where I found Carla's cache in 2019. I'm not saying that's where she was when the searchers came closest. I don't know. But I've been back to that section of country a few times in the years since, looking at the terrain differently now that I know what I know. And there are places in the upper walls of that gully where a person could be, lying low, sheltered by overhang, below the sightline of searchers on the trail above, completely invisible. The creek noise at the bottom of the gully runs loud enough to mask shouting from 30 feet away during high water. In late August, after a significant rain event, that creek would have been running very loud. I'm not going to let that thought go anywhere it doesn't need to go. I'm just saying I understand now why 11 days of searching didn't find her. Quick thing before we go deeper. A lot of what I've learned about Bigfoot doesn't fit into these videos, so I put it all in a book. It's called The Bigfoot Codex. If you want more, it's linked below. Either way, let's stay with Dennis's story. The morning I found her was July.
Quick thing before we move on. I have this book coming out. It's called The Dogman Codex. It's a compilation of all my research and findings. Been working on it for a long time. So if you want to check that out, links down below. Now let's get you back to the video.
The morning I found her was July 14th, 2019. I was doing condition checks on a stretch of trail up Crow Creek, which forks off the Entiat about 4 miles up the valley from the trailhead. It's not a high-traffic route. Gets some use early in the season when the snow melts out of the lower sections. A few elk hunters in the fall. Midsummer, it's quiet. My job that day was straightforward. walk the first 6 miles from the trailhead, note any washouts or blowdown blocking the route, check a pair of informal campsites near the 3-mile mark that had been getting some trash issues, and turn around. Should have been back at my truck by early afternoon. I'd driven up the Entiat Valley that morning in my district truck, a Forest Service green F-250 that was 6 years old and had 140,000 miles on it and a driver's side window that wouldn't roll all the way up. Left the truck at the Crow Creek trailhead at 7 in the morning. The trailhead is just a wide spot in the road with a Forest Service brown sign and a register box that gets vandalized every couple of years and replaced with a new one. There were no other vehicles. There almost never are in July. The trail is too steep and too long and too poorly marked for casual day hikers, and the serious backpackers who use the upper basin go in earlier in the season when the wildflowers are out. I signed the register, shouldered my kit, radio, basic first aid, bear spray, 2 liters of water, a sandwich, and an apple I'd packed at the station, my GPS, a notebook for trail observations, and started up. The first 2 miles of the Crow Creek Trail gain about 1 to 200 feet through old second-growth ponderosa and some scattered larch before it levels off slightly in a section of mixed timber and alder along the creek bottom. The morning was clear, cool for July at that elevation, probably 50 degrees when I left the truck. By the time I hit the 2-mile mark, I was warm enough to shed my outer layer and tie it to my pack. I was 4 miles in when I found the cache. It was off-trail, maybe 30 yards upslope from the path, in a cluster of subalpine fir, the kind of dense, low-branched trees that grow at around 5,000 feet in that part of the Cascades. I'd gone off the trail to check a blowdown that looked recent, a big larch that had come down and might have partially blocked the path in another 10 or 20 yards. And I noticed a color that didn't belong. Blue, synthetic, the kind of faded royal blue that REI gear from the early 2000s tended to be before everything shifted to black and charcoal. I went up for a look. It was a pack, old external frame, the kind with the aluminum stays and the hip belt that sat too high and dug into your hip bones if you loaded it wrong. Rye brand, very faded, the blue I'd spotted through the trees. It was hanging from a branch about 8 feet off the ground, suspended from a length of parachute cord that had been looped around the branch and tied off carefully. Below it, on the ground, there were other things. A pair of water bottles, not modern Nalgene's, the older style with a different mouth diameter. A stuff sack, also old. A foam sleeping pad rolled up tight and tied with a strip of what looked like bark fiber rope, crude, hand-twisted. My first thought was a stash. Hunters sometimes cache gear in the backcountry, especially in remote country where they know they'll be back. But this wasn't hunting country. The elevation was wrong. The terrain too steep for the kind of elk hunting that draws people into cache situations. And the gear was old, years old, decade-old. I stood there looking at it for a moment with the sound of Crow Creek somewhere below me and a Clark's nutcracker going off in the firs, and something tightened in my chest that I couldn't immediately name. I reached up and touched the pack. The fabric was weathered but intact, not rotted through. The rain cover was still clipped to the bottom. I turned it slightly on its cord. On the top lid pocket, in black permanent marker, faded but legible, "C. Freely." I stood very still for what was probably 15 seconds. I know the feeling I had in that moment because I've had it twice before in 16 years of rangering. Once when I found a child's sneaker at the edge of a river during a search for a missing 5-year-old in the Methau, and once when I rolled over a half-buried sleeping bag in a remote drainage that turned out to contain a man who had walked 40 miles into the backcountry to die alone. The feeling is a specific kind of dread that isn't panic and isn't quite fear. It's the feeling of standing at the edge of something consequential, of knowing you are one step away from a different kind of morning than the one you started with. Then I reached for my radio. I was in a drainage with no line of sight to the ridge, which meant no radio contact with the district office or the county repeater. This is a known issue in the Entiat country. The valley walls block transmission until you get above about 500-800 feet, and the Crow Creek Trail doesn't hit that elevation until past the 6-mile mark. I noted the location on my GPS, took photographs of the cache with my personal phone, and made a decision. I would not disturb the cache. I would continue up the trail to an elevation where I could get a transmission out, make the call, and then come back down and wait. I was about halfway through deciding this when I heard the movement. It was upslope, above the cluster of firs, in the denser timber above. Not a sudden sound, not crashing, not running, but the specific kind of sound that comes from something large moving through dry timber slowly, deliberately, placing its weight carefully. I've spent enough years in that country to know what deer sound like versus elk versus black bear versus the occasional mule deer that drifts up from the Columbia side. This was bigger than a deer and moving on 2 contact points, not 4. A bear can do that for short distances, but the gait sounds different. Shuffling, uncertain. This was even, deliberate, bipedal, and it was pacing, not coming toward me, not moving away, pacing back and forth, maybe 40 feet above me in the trees, and it had been doing it for, I realized with a strange lurch, longer than I'd been standing there. I'd been so focused on the pack that I hadn't registered the sound until it stopped, briefly, and then resumed, and the contrast made it audible. Something up in the timber had been watching me go through that cache. I did not reach for the bear spray on my belt, which I should mention was my standard backcountry carry along with a radio and a basic kit. I didn't reach for it because the sound didn't read as threat behavior to me in that moment. It read as attention, as if whatever was up there was assessing, the way you assess something you're uncertain about, trying to decide. I said out loud, not loudly, "Hello." The pacing stopped. Then a voice said, "Don't use the radio." It was a woman's voice, and it came from about 25 feet above me, somewhere in the dark interior of the fir stand, low, careful, the words spaced with a kind of deliberateness that sounded like someone who hadn't spoken English in a while and was making sure they had it right. I'm going to tell you honestly that my hand moved toward my radio. I'm not going to pretend it didn't. Old reflexes, radio first. But something stopped me, and I think it was the fact that the voice sounded frightened, not of me specifically, or not only of me, of what the radio represented. I left my hand where it was. "Okay," I said. "I'm not using it." Silence. The kind the forest makes when something large is holding completely still. "Are you hurt?" I said. "No." "Are you Carla Freely?" A longer silence this time. I could hear the creek below. The nutcracker had gone quiet. "Yes," she said. She came down out of the firs slowly, and I want to be specific about this because the details matter. She was moving carefully, watching her footing on the steep slope, and she was watching me at the same time. She was wearing clothing that was partially her original gear. I could see that. the day pack she'd had on, strapped to her back now, and what had been hiking pants were cut off below the knee and repaired in places with cord and what looked like sinew. Over that she wore a kind of poncho or overgarment that I did not immediately recognize as any commercial product. It was heavy, layered, made from something I later understood was a combination of processed hide and what appeared to be thick moss fibers woven together in a way I had no frame of reference for. It moved well. It shed water. It was clearly something she'd been wearing for a long time, and that had been modified and repaired repeatedly. She was thin in the way that people who do serious physical work in the backcountry are thin, not unhealthy, thin, functional thin, lean through the arms and shoulders. Her hair was dark and long, twisted back and held with a wooden pin of some kind. She had a scar on her left forearm, healed old, and several smaller ones on her hands and shins that you see on anyone who spends real time in rough terrain. She stopped about 10 feet from me and looked at me directly. Her eyes were, I'm going to sound like an idiot saying this, cautious in a particular way that I've seen in wildlife more than in people. Not wild, not feral, aware. She was reading me the way you read terrain, looking for hazards, calculating. "How did you find the pack?" she said. "Blowdown drew me off the trail," I said, checking for obstructions. I wasn't looking for anything. She nodded once like that was the right kind of answer. Then she said, "I need you to not report this. I am a law enforcement ranger. That is a specific kind of ranger. We carry a badge and have citation authority, and we are required by our commission to report certain things. And a missing person turning up alive after 15 years is absolutely one of those things. I want to be clear about that context before I tell you what I said next." I said, "Tell me why." She looked at me for a long time. The creek sound moved between us. "Because of what I'd have to tell them," she said. "What would you have to tell them?" She looked up the slope, back into the timber above us, then back at me. Something moved in her expression that I can't precisely name. Not fear, not exactly. Recognition, maybe. The same thing you see in someone's face when they're trying to figure out how much of the truth is going to be believed. "I'm not alone out here," she said. I looked up the slope where she'd looked. "How many people?" I said. "Not people," she said. She let that sit there for a moment, and in that moment the timber above us was absolutely still, and the creek was running, and a wind came down the drainage from the north carrying the smell that I'm going to describe as accurately as I can. It was layered. Closest to the surface, something earthy and animal. The smell you get from a deer bed in August, musky and warm. Under that was something sharper, a kind of musk that didn't match any animal I knew, a note that was almost like wet fur, and something else I can only describe as green, the smell of deep timber in shade. And under that, at the back of the throat, a faint sweetness, like dried grass or sun-warmed bark, and something else, something old. I'd smelled that third layer before, not on an animal, not on anything I'd ever seen. It was a smell I'd noted twice in 6 years of backcountry work in those drainages, and both times I'd catalogued it as unknown and moved on. The first time was on a solo overnight in the Mad River drainage in 2013, when I'd woken up in my tent at about 2 in the morning with that smell in my nostrils and the specific, certain knowledge that something large was close, and then heard the sound of something moving away through the timber and lay there for a long time listening to it go, telling myself black bear, telling myself it was a black bear, and mostly believing it. The second time was on a day hike up Ramsey Creek in the fall of 2015, a cold October morning, and I'd caught it on a downslope breeze for just a second or two before it was gone. Both times I'd done what you do, noted it mentally, moved on, filed it under unidentified, and left it there. Standing there in the Crow Creek drainage with Carla Freely looking at me from 10 feet away, that smell coming down the slope from above us, I placed it for the first time. The same smell, the same layering, not a black bear, never a black bear. It was coming from whatever was in the trees. "How long have you been with them?" I said. She thought about it. "Since the 2nd week," she said. "Maybe the 3rd. The timeline is different out here. I stopped tracking months pretty fast." 2nd or 3rd week of what? I knew. 2nd or 3rd week after she crossed the log bridge over Cow Creek in August of 2004. "And they've kept you here?" I said. I tried to keep any specific implication out of it. "No," she said, and there was something almost impatient in it. "It's not like that." "What is it like?" She was quiet for a moment. A raven crossed the sky above the drainage, riding a thermal, and we both watched it without meaning to. Then she said, "I was injured. After the 1st day, the 2nd day, I don't know. I went off the trail above Cow Creek. I was trying to shortcut back to the main trail, and I went wrong, slid off a ledge. Not a big drop, maybe 12 feet, but I hit wrong. I cracked some ribs, sprained my ankle badly enough that I couldn't walk on it at all. I had water and some food, and I was below the trail, in a section of the drainage you couldn't see the trail from even in good visibility, and it rained." She paused. The raven was gone. "It rained for 4 days. The creek came up and I couldn't cross back. My ankle swelled up. I was running low on food. She stopped. "I was in bad shape. Day 3 or 4, I heard the searchers. I could hear them above me, on the trail. I yelled until I couldn't yell anymore, and nobody heard me over the creek. I knew from the search file that the Cow Creek drainage had seen significant rainfall that August. The creek had run high through most of the search period, making crossing hazardous and noise travel unreliable. I'd read Lindquist's notes about the roar of the creek on day 4 of the search. His teams had been communicating by hand signals in the lower canyon because the radio traffic was getting masked by ambient noise. A voice from 30 feet below the trail, below a ledge, below the level of the searcher's sight line, and below the threshold where sound could carry over the white noise of high water. That voice wouldn't have been heard. I understood that now in a way I hadn't when I first read the file 7 years before. "And then," she said, "someone found me." She was looking at the slope above us again, the timber, the stillness in it. "One of them," I said. "Yes." What did they do?" She looked back at me, and for the first time something softened in her face, slightly. "Brought me food," she said. "Brought it and left it. Came back later. Did that for, I don't know, a week. 10 days. My ankle started healing. I was able to move a little. By then the searchers had stopped." I thought about the 11 days, the search winding down on day 11. "You couldn't make it back to the trail on your own?" "Not then, and by the time I could." She stopped again, and when she started again, her voice was quieter. By then I'd seen them, seen what they were, and I had to make a decision. "What kind of decision?" She looked at me directly, steadily. "The kind you can't unmake," she said. The wind came down the drainage again, and that smell came with it, stronger this time, closer. I turned my head without thinking about it and looked up the slope. In the timber, maybe 60 feet above us in the shade of the firs, there was a shape that I had been processing as a very large fallen tree. for the previous several minutes and was only now correcting itself in my vision. It was not a fallen tree. It was upright, partially screened by branches, dark against the darker timber behind it. Still the way very large things are still when they decide to be. A stillness with mass behind it, the way a boulder is still rather than the way a bird is still. I could see because of the angle of the slope and the way the morning light was hitting the edge of the timber above us, that the shape was very tall. I could see that the shoulders were broad in a proportion that nothing I had seen in 16 years of backcountry work in the Pacific Northwest matched. I could see that the eyes, dark, set under a pronounced brow, no reflection in this light, were on me. Had been on me, I understood, since before I'd found the pack. I did not move. I did not reach for the radio. "They've been here the whole time," I said. It wasn't a question. "Since you came off the trail," Carla said. "They knew before I did. I didn't hear you until you said hello." I thought about that for a moment, about what it meant that something that large had been that close for that long, and I hadn't known it. I am not a careless person in the field. I pay attention. I've worked in bear country my entire career, and I've become reasonably good at the particular kind of sideways awareness that you develop over years. The peripheral vision, the sound discrimination, the sense of texture in a landscape that shifts when something is in it. I didn't know. Whatever was in the timber above us had been there while I found the pack, read the name, reached for the radio, heard the movement, said hello. It had been there for all of it, and I had not known. "Are there more of them?" I said. "Nearby." "2 others," she said, "farther up the drainage." I nodded slowly. Then I said, "I have to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me." "Okay. Are you here by your own choice? Right now? Today? Are you choosing to be here?" She held my gaze. "Yes," she said, flat, clear, no hesitation. "And you have been since I made the decision," she said. "Yes, every day since then." I looked back up the slope. The shape in the timber had not moved. The stillness of it was doing something to my sense of scale. The way a very large thing in your periphery keeps prompting reassessment, your brain insisting it must be closer or farther than it appears. "Tell me what made you decide," I said. "Not what you decided. Why?" She was quiet long enough that I thought she might not answer. Then she said, "Sit down if you want to hear this. It's going to take a while." I sat down on the slope with my back against the larch blowdown, and Carla Freely sat down about 8 feet away from me, and up the slope in the dark timber the shape stayed where it was and watched us, and she started talking. She described the first real encounter the way you'd describe something you'd reconstructed from sense memory and context, rather than clear observation. She'd been lying in the creek drainage after 3 days, her ankle wrapped in the shirt she'd been wearing over her base layer, her ribs aching badly enough that deep breaths hurt. She had about 1/3 of a protein bar left and her water bottle. The creek was loud. It had been raining on and off since the first day, and the sky, when she could see it through the canopy, was a uniform low gray. She heard the footsteps before she saw anything, slow, evenly spaced, coming down the drainage from above. She said her first thought was that it was a searcher, and she opened her mouth to call out, and then something stopped her. She said she couldn't name what stopped her. Just a recognition, below conscious thought, that the footsteps sounded wrong for a person. The stride was too long, and the cadence was too even, and the placement too deliberate. Like something that was accustomed to moving on rough ground the way water is accustomed to moving, without calculation, just moving the right way automatically. It came around a cluster of boulders about 25 feet from where she was lying and stopped. She said it looked at her for a long time. She looked back. She said she was, in that moment, genuinely not afraid. She was aware later that this was probably a combination of pain medication, dehydration, hypothermia risk, and the particular mental state that sets in after 3 days of survival stress, which is a kind of floating calm, where the emotional response machinery stops working quite right. But whatever the cause, she lay there with broken ribs and a sprained ankle and looked at something that was standing 8 feet tall in the rain. And she didn't scream. She didn't have it in her. It came closer, crouched down onto its haunches, which brought it to roughly her eye level, and she could see its face from maybe 10 feet away. She described the face carefully, and I'm going to try to relay her description faithfully. Heavy, pronounced brow ridge, a flatter facial structure than a bear or any other primate she had a reference for. Dark skin under the fur, eyes that were dark brown or black with no visible white, deeply set. The nose was broad, the nostrils wide. The fur around the face was shorter and finer than on the body, a brownish-gray color, not the coal-black or reddish-brown she'd expected from descriptions she'd heard. The expression, she said, was neither aggressive nor gentle. It was assessing, in the specific way that very intelligent things assess uncertain situations. She told me that the size of it was the thing that kept resetting her comprehension. She'd think she understood what she was looking at, and then she'd look at the hand. One hand resting on a boulder beside her, 4 fingers curved around the edge of the rock. And the scale of that hand against the rock would recalibrate everything. The fingers were each as thick as her wrist. The knuckles were prominent, dark, the skin there thicker than on the palm. The nails, if that's the right word, were broad and flat, more like a person's than an animal's, trimmed short not by cutting but by wear. She said she remembers thinking, lying there in the rain with cracked ribs, that whatever else it was old. The face had that quality, not age in the way that degrades things, but age in the way that settles them. It reached out. This is the part she came back to multiple times, the part she said she couldn't get her brain around. Reached out one hand and placed 2 fingers, carefully, against the side of her face. Not grabbing, not forceful. The way you'd check a child for fever, that light placement of skin against skin. Then it stood up and left. It came back the next morning with food. She said she heard it approaching and sat up as best she could, and it came around the boulders and set something down about 6 feet from her and backed away. The food was a section of carcass, a deer, she thought, that had been processed in a way that suggested fire had been involved somewhere upstream in the preparation. The meat was not raw. It was partially cooked, smoked maybe, the surface darkened and dry, the interior still pink but warm enough to be recent. Alongside the meat, there was something else, a bundle of plants she didn't recognize, tied with grass, leaves mostly, some with roots still attached. She didn't eat the plants that first time. She wasn't sure enough of what they were. She ate the meat. Over the following days, she said, the pattern established itself. Food once a day, sometimes twice. Always left rather than handed, always from a respectful distance, always after a pause in which the thing, she had started thinking of it as the one who found her, would crouch and look at her and wait. She started talking to it during those pauses, not because she expected comprehension, because she needed to hear a voice, even her own. She talked about nursing school, about a pharmacology exam she'd been worried about before she left for the hike, about her mother's habit of calling her every night at 7, which Carla had found annoying, and now, lying in a drainage with broken ribs and rain coming through the canopy, understood differently. She said the Guardian, she wasn't calling it that yet, that name came later, would stay through the talking, not responding, not making sounds of its own during these sessions, but staying, sitting on its haunches or leaning against a boulder with its long arms across its knees, and its face directed at her with an attention that she said felt like being read. The way you feel read when a person who is genuinely listening is listening, not waiting for their turn to talk, but actually taking in what you're saying. "Did it understand you?" I asked. "What you were saying?" She thought about this. "I don't know," she said. "I think it understood something, whether it was the words or the tone, or just the fact of talking. I can't separate those things. What I know is that when I stopped talking, it would stay a little longer and then leave. And when I talked, it would stay for the whole time. So I talked." Her ankle began to heal, slower than it would have in normal circumstances, faster than she expected given the conditions. On what she estimated was the 8th or 9th day, she was able to stand and put partial weight on it. By then, she'd started eating the plants the Guardian brought. She'd identified enough of them by sight to be reasonably confident. Wild ginger, which she knew from a foraging book she'd read in a botany elective, fireweed, cattail roots from somewhere lower in the drainage. The ones she couldn't identify, she ate small amounts of and waited. None of them made her sick. On the 12th or 13th day, she made it to the creek bank. She said the searchers had been gone for at least 2 days by then. The trail above her, she found when she finally climbed back to it, had washed out in a section above the creek crossing that would have hidden her boot prints anyway. Even if she'd made it back to the trail on day 3 or 4, she might have been above the search grid. I asked her, when she reached the trail, why didn't she walk out? She said, because I'd already seen the others. The one who found her, she called it the Guardian, not as a spiritual designation, just a functional one, the one who stood watch, was, she understood by the time she could move, part of a family group. There were at least 4 others, maybe more, in the upper drainage. She had caught glimpses of them during her recovery. Smaller ones, she thought, juveniles, who watched her from the edges of the boulder field with open curiosity and retreated when she looked at them directly. At least one other adult, female, she thought, though she said she couldn't explain clearly what made her read it that way. A combination of proportions and the way it moved and something in the face that wasn't exactly delicacy, but wasn't the same weight as the Guardian either. And once, from a distance, something much larger than the one who had found her, older-looking, moving slowly on a different slope, that didn't come close and didn't seem to take particular notice of her. On the day she made it back to the trail, she stood there for a while. She could see down the drainage to where the trail curved out of sight toward the trailhead, toward the log bridge over Cow Creek, toward the parking lot, toward her car, toward her parents' house in the town of Entiat, 12 miles away. She could be back in Entiat by nightfall if she walked. The Guardian was behind her, she knew. She hadn't heard it, but she didn't need to by then. She could feel it, the presence of something large and quiet at the tree line. Watching, she said. I thought about what I was going to tell people. I thought about what the story was going to be. I thought about the hospital and the debriefs and the news coverage. I thought about being the girl from Entiat who survived 15 days in the backcountry on her own. That's the story I could tell, the one where I found a deer carcass and ate it because I had to, the one where I injured myself off trail and healed up slow. I could tell that story, and people would believe it. And the other story, I said. There is no other story, she said, not one anyone would leave alone once they heard it. I thought about the photograph that would have existed within 48 hours, about the researchers who would have arrived inside a week, about the cordons and the surveys and the years of activity in that drainage, in every drainage adjacent to it, in the broader Entiat country, about what that activity would mean for the family group in the upper reaches of Crow Creek. I thought about whether she'd been thinking about any of that on the day she stood at the trail junction and made her decision. "Were you thinking about protecting them?" I said. "Or protecting yourself?" She looked at me evenly. "Both," she said. "Is there a version of that story where I say one and not the other, and you believe me?" "No," I said. "Then both," she said again. She turned toward the upper drainage instead of toward the trailhead, walked 3 miles up the trail to a basin she'd identified during her recovery as a place the family group used as a kind of base area, a high granite cirque at the head of the drainage with a south-facing talus slope that held heat well into evening. She set up there. She built a shelter, eventually. She learned to move in that country in a way she hadn't learned hiking on maintained trails with a map and a day pack. She learned what she could eat and when and how. She made, over the following months, the kind of knowledge that takes years to fully describe, and that most people in industrialized society have lost several generations back. And the Guardian and the others let her. More than let her. The food continued, on and off, through the first winter, which she said was the hardest thing she had ever done in her life, and which she described with a kind of flatness that told me she still wasn't entirely through processing it. She had frostbite in the first 3 fingers of her left hand that resolved without permanent damage, which she attributed partly to luck and partly to techniques the Guardian had shown her. She said showed me, and when I asked her to explain that, she said it would do something and wait for her to do the same thing, and if she did it wrong, it would do it again, and if she still did it wrong, it would place its hands over her hands and guide them through the motion. She said it the way you'd describe a practical, functional relationship. The relationship between someone who knows how to do something and someone learning. Not a mystical exchange. Instruction. That first winter, she almost died twice. The first time was in early December, before she'd built the shelter to the point where it could hold heat through a night below 0. She'd woken before dawn, with her core temperature dropping. That specific kind of cold where you stop shivering because your body has given up on shivering, as a useful response, and she couldn't get her hands to work well enough to add wood to the fire. The Guardian came before first light. She doesn't know how it knew. It came and rebuilt the fire and sat between her and the open side of the shelter through the rest of that night. Its body a windbreak, its heat, and it ran hot, she said. She could feel the warmth coming off it from 2 feet away, serving as what a sleeping bag couldn't. She said she drifted in and out of consciousness, and when she woke up with the light, she was warm, and the Guardian was gone, and the fire was still going. The second time was a fall through ice on the frozen section of the creek in late February. She went through in about 3 feet of water, but the combination of the cold water shock and the ice she had to break to get back out, and the distance from her shelter, nearly a mile, put her close to the margin. She stripped to the skin in the cold and ran, which is the right decision, and the decision her backcountry training had given her a decade earlier, even though the training had been for a different set of circumstances. She made it to the shelter and to dry clothes. When the Guardian arrived that evening, it brought something she hadn't seen before. A bundle of inner bark from what she later identified as a Pacific yew, Taxus brevifolia, which grows in some of the protected drainages on the western slope of the Entiat country. She didn't know what to do with it, and the Guardian demonstrated, stripped it into fibers and placed it in hot water. It heated over the fire, something between a tea and a decoction. She drank it. Her core temperature recovered through that night faster than she expected. She mentioned the yew bark specifically because she looked it up later, years later, when she'd made one of her infrequent trips to the edge of the valley and found a discarded magazine in a recycling bin near one of the lower summer homes. The magazine was 3 years old and wasn't medical literature, but it had a brief item about Pacific yew research. The tree's inner bark contains taxol precursors, compounds that had been the subject of pharmaceutical research since the 1960s, and the bark and needles have a long history in the ethnobotanical record among several Pacific Northwest tribes as treatments for a range of conditions. Whether what the Guardian brought her was a deliberate medicine or simply something it knew was useful for the cold, she couldn't say. But she noted it. By the second year, she was not relying on them for food. She had learned the drainage the way the drainage needed to be learned. The seasonal movements, the game trails that were also their trails, the plant calendar, the water sources that ran year-round versus the ones that dried up by August. She had territory that was hers, and territory that was theirs, and territory that was shared, and the boundaries were understood without being stated, which she acknowledged was the strangest thing to try to explain to a person who had spent their life in a world full of stated boundaries. "Do they communicate?" I said. "With you, specifically?" "Not the way you and I are talking," she said, "but yes." "How?" She thought about this for a while. "Gesture, mostly," she said. "And sound, but not language, and placement. Where they stand relative to where I am, where they leave things, which direction they go when they leave. Context. You learn to read context when that's what you have." I asked her to give me an example. She said, in the 3rd year, she'd been working a section of the upper basin she'd been using for plant gathering, a south-facing slope with good sun exposure where a variety of roots and greens came on earlier than in the shadier sections. One morning the Guardian came to the margin of her territory and stood there, not coming in, and looked toward that slope. Just looked for maybe 10 seconds. Then it left. She said she spent a few hours thinking about that look before she decided it meant she should stay away from that slope for a while. She stayed away for 3 weeks. When she eventually went back, she found that the section of hillside she'd been using had been disturbed. Not by the family group, she didn't think, but by some other activity she couldn't immediately identify. Eventually, she worked out that there'd been a late-season slide above, not large enough to reach her gathering area, but large enough to destabilize the slope and make it hazardous. She'd been going up there twice a week. The Guardian had told her not to, with a look and a direction, and she hadn't understood until she went back and saw what it had known was coming. "After 15 years, I said. "After 15 years. She agreed. I looked up the slope again. The shape in the timber had not moved, but I had the specific sense, and I want to be honest about how unverifiable this feeling is, because it's not evidence of anything. I had the sense that it was following the conversation, not the words, the tone, the register of two people talking quietly, on a slope, the pauses, the pace. The way you can sometimes tell, watching two people talk in a language you don't speak, whether the conversation is hostile or neutral or warm. I thought it knew the conversation was going well. You said two others farther up the drainage, I said. The family group is still here, after 15 years? Mostly, she said. The territory overlaps with a couple of other drainages. There are others I've seen in passing over the years who I don't see regularly. The core group is smaller than it was. She said it with a specific quality in her voice. I didn't press it. The guardian, I said. The one who found you. Still here, she said. That's who's in the timber. I looked up the slope again. The shape, the stillness. It's been there the whole time, I said. Since before you found the pack, she said. I processed that. I thought about the sequence, the blowdown, me going off trail, the shape in the timber that had been still enough that I'd processed it as a fallen tree without actually checking that assumption. How long it had been there before I arrived, whether it had watched me come up the trail. It followed you here, I said, or was already here. Carla shook her head slightly. They don't follow, she said. They know where things are. It's different. I didn't ask her to explain that further. Some things in the backcountry you learn to take as given without needing the mechanism explained. The way elk know which drainages have had hunters in them and which haven't. The way ravens show up within 20 minutes of any hunting camp where there's fresh meat. The knowing. The kind of attention to territory that makes it feel like the land itself has awareness. I'd always understood that as animal intelligence applied to the landscape at a resolution that human cognition doesn't naturally produce. I didn't have a better model for what she was describing. I said, your family, your mother. She looked at her hands. I know, she said. She's been... I know, she said again. I kept track for a long time, the website. I could see it from down in the valley when I'd go to the edge of the timber above the orchards, before the summer houses went in and the lighting changed. I couldn't read it, but I could see it was still there. I know what I did to her. Her voice was steady when she said it, but there was something underneath the steadiness that I recognized, the kind of knowledge that's been carried so long it's become structural, load-bearing, the thing you're built around now rather than the thing that broke you. I can't tell you that's okay, I said. I know you can't. We sat with that for a moment. What do you want from this conversation? I said. You came down when you saw me. You could have stayed in the timber. You didn't have to come down. She was quiet. The creek ran below us. A hawk. I couldn't identify it at that distance, a buteo of some kind. Crossed the drainage high up. Working the thermals off the south slope. The pack, she said finally. I wanted to get it down before it degraded more. I've been meaning to for years. It's not right, leaving it there. It was my mother's, originally, not mine. I borrowed it for that trip and never gave it back. She'd come down for the pack, and I'd found the pack first. That was the circumstance. She'd watched me find it, made the assessment, decided to speak. And now, I said, now I need you to decide what you're going to do, she said. I looked up at the shape in the timber, at the size of it, at the complete, patient stillness. I thought about the report, about what the report meant and what it would set in motion. Can I ask you something? I said. Yes. In 15 years, I said. Has anyone else come this far up this drainage? Other rangers, hunters, anyone? 3 times, she said. Hunters, twice. They turned back before the 4-mile mark. One time it was a ranger, maybe 7 years ago. He was checking the trail, same as you. He turned back at the 3-mile mark. I knew who that was. Rob Mattingly, my predecessor in the Entiat District, who had retired in 2015. Meticulous man, good rangering instincts, now living in Chelan and doing volunteer work with the County Land Trust. He'd turned back at the 3-mile mark on a Crow Creek check and never written up a reason beyond trail conditions deteriorating. I'd always assumed it was a weather call. And you weren't seen? No. Why are you letting me see you? I said. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked up the slope at the shape in the timber. I didn't decide that, she said. I followed her eyes to the timber, to the stillness there. I sat with that for a long moment. Then I said, "Tell me the rest." She told me about the winter of the 5th year first, because she said that was the thing I'd need to understand before the rest made any sense. December of her 5th year in the drainage. She'd established by then what she described as a functional shelter, not comfortable by any standard she'd had in her previous life, but functional. A structure built into the south face of a granite outcrop at roughly 6,000 feet, using the rock as 2 walls and roof. The other 2 sides framed with poles and insulated with bark slabs and packed moss, in a technique she'd arrived at through trial and catastrophic failure. The Guardian had shown her something about the layering, the way the moss held heat if it was packed correctly, the thickness differential needed between the floor layer and the wall layer. She'd been warm enough the previous 2 winters. She had stores, dried meat, dried roots, a variety of things she'd learned to process from the valley plants that didn't sound appetizing to me, and that she described with a matter-of-factness that was its own kind of eloquence. She had a routine, a life of a kind. In December of the 5th year, one of the family group didn't come back from the upper drainage. She became aware of it the way she'd become aware of most things up there by then. Not through direct observation, but through the behavior of the others. A change in the patterns. The Guardian, spending more time than usual in the timber above her shelter, moving back and forth along the ridge in the long stride pace that she'd learned to read as something between agitation and vigilance. The juvenile she'd named, in her head, November. She dated it to the month she'd first clearly seen it, November of her 2nd year. Stopped coming to the margins of her territory and disappeared into the upper country with the others. She waited. She didn't go up. On the 3rd day, the Guardian came back to the shelter area with the younger adult, the one she called Birch because she'd first seen it silhouetted against a birch stand on the eastern exposure. And they were together in a way that read differently than their usual movements. She'd learned to read proximity as communication by then, how close together they moved, whether they stayed at the same elevation or one moved higher than the other, whether there was the low vocalization that meant something being discussed versus the silence that meant something settled. This was the silence of something settled, and not in a good way. A particular absence of sound around the 2 of them that she'd only experienced once before, when something had happened in the upper drainage that she never fully understood. On the 4th day, she found the place where the missing one had been. She'd gone up. She went up carefully, not directly, angling across the slope to come in from below the wind, and found a section of the upper talus field that was different. Rocks displaced. Not in the way rockfall displaces things, that random pattern of impact and roll, but in a deliberate way, a clearing. Something had been done there. She said she spent a long time looking at it, and then looking at the surrounding terrain, the trees, the rock faces, the snowpack, and she said she understood something that she didn't have words for. Not in the sense of a concept she couldn't verbalize, but in the sense of a concept that didn't exist in English. The missing one was gone in the way that the family group understood gone, and the place on the talus was part of how that was acknowledged. She went back down to her shelter. That night the guardian came and sat outside her shelter, close enough that she could hear the long, slow rhythm of its breathing. It didn't make any sound beyond the breathing. It sat there for a long time, until some time passed, what she estimated was midnight, and then she heard it move away. She said, "I understood in that moment that whatever they were, they mourned, or something that functioned as mourning. They had a relationship to loss that was specific and deliberate and had a form. They didn't just experience the absence, they marked it, and the marking included me." She looked at the slope below us when she said that, not at me, the way people look away from you when they're saying something they've been carrying for a long time and aren't sure they want to see your face. Receive it. "It included you," I said. "It sat outside my shelter," she said. "On the night something in the family died, it came to where I was and it was present. If that doesn't mean what I think it means, I don't know how to interpret 15 years of evidence." I didn't say anything. I thought about what that meant, applied to the specific category of creature I was looking at up the slope. The implications of mourning, the implications of a family group that registered one of its members as gone and sat with that grief, in proximity to the human who was also, by then, part of the territory, part of the understood world. "How many have you lost?" I said, "in 15 years?" "3, she said. "That I know of. The numbers in the upper drainage shift. I don't have complete visibility into the whole territory, but 3 that I was close enough to notice the absence." "How did you handle that?" I said. She thought about it. "The same way they did," she said. "Which is, I went to the places where those ones used to be and I sat there. I don't know if that reads to them as the same kind of thing they do, but it's what I had." She talked for a long time. I'm not going to try to compress what she said into a short version because it doesn't compress well, and because most of the important parts were in the texture rather than the facts. She told me about the 3rd year specifically. Year 3 was when her understanding of what she was living inside shifted from something she was surviving to something she was inhabiting. The distinction took a while to articulate, and I want to get it right because it's the hinge of everything that came after. In the first 2 years, she'd been operating in a state of extended emergency management. Every week was a problem set: food, warmth, water, shelter, integrity, health. She'd lost weight the first winter and spent the spring rebuilding. She'd made mistakes that cost her. The icefall she told me about. A burn she got from an improvised cook fire with green wood that didn't draft right and sent a smoke backdraft into her shelter in year 2, leaving her coughing for 2 weeks. The kind of mistakes you make when you're learning a completely new set of skills at speed, with real consequences for failure. In year 3, the mistakes got fewer. The margin got wider. She started having time that wasn't accounted for by immediate necessity, and what she did with that time was observe. She built, she told me, a kind of journal. Not on paper. She didn't have paper, but in her head, structured the way she'd structured notes in nursing school. She had a system, family group observations in one category, who was where, what they were doing, what the interactions between them looked like over time. Territory observations in another, what the family group's range looked like across seasons, where the boundaries were, where they overlapped with what she understood as her own range, what those overlaps meant in practice. A third category, for what she called anomalies. Things she observed that she couldn't fit into either of the first two categories, and that accumulated over years into a set of questions she's still carrying. The individual members of the family group, as she'd catalogued them by year 3, were the guardian, the one who had found her, adult male, she believed, the largest and oldest-looking of the group, with a distinctive gray-brown coloring and a particular way of moving at rest. A slight forward lean when standing still, the weight more on the forefoot than the heel, which she later observed was characteristic of all of them, but most pronounced in the guardian. Birch, the younger adult, female, she thought, with darker fur on the upper back and a narrowness through the shoulders compared to the guardian. November, the juvenile from her second year, now moving into what looked like late adolescence in year 3. Growing fast, awkward in the specific way juveniles are awkward, limbs slightly too long for the rest of it, and 2 others she hadn't been sure of until year 3. A very young one, perhaps a year or 2 old when she first clearly observed it, that she had only glimpsed in the second year because it was kept back from her area consistently, and the large old one she'd seen from a distance in the first weeks, which she began to see more clearly in year 3. Much older than the guardian, moving with a slowness that was deliberate rather than impaired, carrying what she described as a kind of gravitational weight that she felt even at 100 yards. That old one, she said, she never named. It felt wrong to name it. Some things you don't name because naming implies a certain kind of claim, and that claim felt wrong. I asked her at some point in the conversation whether she'd had any contact with the outside world, phone, internet, anything. She said no, not in any sustained way. The satellite phone she'd been given by a county social worker when she'd done a brief check-in visit to Wenatchee in 2013. Yes, she'd been down once before, briefly, and hadn't mentioned it earlier because it was complicated. She'd kept for emergency use but hadn't used it for its intended purpose. She'd read the number programmed into it often enough that she'd memorized it but had never dialed it. The phone's battery had died within a year of the visit, and she'd never found a way to recharge it. The 2013 visit. I hadn't known about that, and it changed my understanding of the timeline. She'd come down in the late spring of her 9th year, she said. Not to Entiat, not to the sheriff's office, but to Wenatchee. She'd walked off the ridge on the western face in a section where the terrain drops fast into the valley above the town, and she'd come in along a rural road that took her to a gas station on the highway. She'd been in town for about 4 hours. She'd bought food. Things she'd been missing, she said, and she listed them without embarrassment. Orange juice, a chocolate bar, a bag of those small powdered donuts. She'd sat on a bench outside a dollar store and eaten the donuts and watched people walk past, and felt, she said, like something that had come up from underwater and wasn't sure how long it could stay on the surface. She'd gone to the county services office and given a false name. She'd said she was a seasonal agricultural worker who'd fallen off the radar for a while and needed to know what options existed for someone in her situation. The social worker who talked to her, a young man she described as earnest and overwhelmed in equal measure, had given her a list of resources and a satellite phone from a domestic services program. He hadn't pushed her for documentation. She'd thanked him and left, and been back in the drainage by midnight of the same day. She hadn't gone down since, not until she walked out to the county sheriff's office in August of 2019. I asked why she came down in 2013, what the need was. She was quiet for a bit. Then she said, I needed to know if I could still do it, navigate in a world with stores and buildings and strangers looking at me. After 9 years. She paused. I could, but it was harder than I expected, not practically, psychologically. Everything moved at a speed I'd stopped being calibrated for. The noise was different. Inside buildings, the air felt wrong. I sat on that bench and watched people walk past me, and I understood something I'd been not understanding for years, which is that the life I'd been living wasn't a gap in my actual life. It was the life. The 9 years wasn't an interruption. It was the thing itself. She told me about the 3rd year's winter solstice. She'd noticed in the first 2 years that something happened around the longest night, an increase in vocalizations from the upper drainage over the days surrounding it, the family group together in ways they weren't together at other times, something that had a structure and a duration and seemed deliberate. In year 3, she went up to observe, rather than staying in her shelter as she had the previous 2 years. She went up before dark and positioned herself on a rock shelf above the main basin, downwind, in a spot she'd used as an observation point for months. What she saw she described to me carefully and slowly, the way you describe something you've spent years trying to find the right language for. The family group was together in the open basin, in the last light before full dark. All of them, including the young one and the old one. They moved in a pattern that she couldn't immediately decode, but that had, she was certain, a structure. Not random movement, not the functional movement of feeding or social grooming or any behavior with a clear practical function, but something more like the movement of a ceremony. She used that word and then immediately qualified it. She said she didn't know what else to call it, and she didn't want to imply more than she was certain of. The vocalizations during this went on for a long time. Low, resonant sounds that she felt in her sternum as much as heard. Some of them call and response patterns between individuals, some sustained by the group together. The old one's voice was the deepest, the most penetrating. She said she felt it in her back teeth. She watched for 2 hours. When the light was fully gone, she came back down to her shelter. She lay in the dark for a long time that night, thinking about what the shortest day of the year meant to something that had been living in those drainages. That specific terrain, that specific set of seasons, for who knows how many generations. She thought about what it means to mark time when you have no calendar and no clock and no writing, just the sky and the land and the length of the light, and how long you'd have to live in one place before the patterns of it became something you held as deeply as your own heartbeat. She said that night was the point when she stopped thinking of them as something she was observing and started thinking of them as something she was living alongside. The distinction matters. It changed what she paid attention to. It changed what she let herself understand. In year 4, she told me, she had her first real territorial incident. I'd asked about aggression earlier, and she'd mentioned year 3, but there was a year 4 event she described separately because it was different in kind. She'd been ranging wider than usual that spring, exploring the upper sections of the eastern ridge that bounded the Crow Creek drainage on the right side. She'd been there a handful of times, brief visits, nothing that she'd felt was unwelcome. But one afternoon in late May, coming down off the ridge toward the basin, she came around a granite shoulder and stopped. Below her, maybe 100 feet, there was a sight she hadn't seen before. A section of flat ground between 2 large boulders that had been modified. There was no other word for it. The boulders had things wedged between them, bundles of organic material, sticks, wrapped bundles of grass and bark, objects she couldn't identify from her distance and angle. The flat ground in front of the boulders had been cleared, and the clearing was very deliberate, the kind of deliberate you see when something with hands has been working in a space over time. It wasn't random. It had an orientation. She stood there for a moment, and then from directly behind her, the sound came. She'd heard the Guardian's warning vocalization once before, briefly, when November had drifted too close to her shelter in the second year and been called back. This was the same sound, but at a different volume and duration. Close, behind her, and sustained. She turned, and the Guardian was maybe 20 feet up the slope, and its expression, the expression she could read after 4 years of proximity, was very clear. She said it wasn't anger. It was closer to alarm. The way you look at someone who has walked into a room they weren't supposed to walk into, and you haven't yet figured out the implications. She backed away. She went back down the ridge and didn't return to that section for the rest of that year. But she thought about what she'd seen at the site between the boulders. Thought about it for years, actually. And what she said to me about it, sitting on that slope in the Crow Creek drainage in July of 2019, was this: I think there are things in that territory that belong only to them. Not territory in the sense of range or resources, something more like private ground, places that are theirs in a way that even I, after all that time, don't have access to. And the Guardian's response when I came too close to one of those places wasn't hostility. It was the look you give someone who has blundered into your private business, and you both know it, and you're trying to give them the chance to back out before it becomes a problem. She paused. I backed out, she said, and it was never a problem. I asked her about Birch, the younger adult, the one she'd thought of as female. She talked about Birch separately from the Guardian, because the relationship was different in character. The Guardian's attention to Carla had always had a certain quality of authority to it. The one who decided things, the one whose presence in her territory was a kind of oversight, benign but real. Birch was something else, more lateral, more, she said, the way you'd describe a neighbor than a guardian. Birch had started coming to the margins of Carla's territory in year 2 with the young one, the infant she'd only glimpsed in the first year. By year 3, the young one was moving on its own, following Birch at a short distance, and Carla had been seeing it clearly enough to understand it was growing fast, and was curious about her in a way the adults managed, but didn't seem to suppress entirely. She said it had its mother's coloring, darker on the upper back, a brownish black that in certain light had a reddish undertone she'd noticed in neither the Guardian nor the old one. Its eyes were amber in its first year, darkening toward brown as it got older. She wasn't sure exactly how old it was when it first approached her directly. Year 5, which means it would have been 3 or 4 years old, roughly. She'd been sitting outside her shelter on a warm afternoon in late July, processing roots, splitting and drying a batch of arrowhead tubers she'd pulled from a wet section of the lower creek. And she looked up, and the young one was standing about 12 feet away, just standing there, looking at her work. Birch was at the tree line, present and visible, not intervening. Carla kept working. She didn't look directly at it. She said her experience by year 5 was that direct eye contact with any of them, with the young one especially, was the thing most likely to produce retreat, and she didn't want it to retreat. So she kept her eyes on her work and let it do what it was going to do. What it did was sit down. It sat about 8 feet from her, in the same approximate way she was sitting. legs in front, back straight, watching her hands work. And it sat there for maybe half an hour, just watching. Then Birch made a sound from the tree line, and it got up and went back. But it came back the next afternoon, and the one after that. By the end of that summer, Carla said she would sometimes set out a root or a section of dried meat at the edge of her processing area before sitting down to work, and the young one would come and take it while she worked, and they would sit in a rough, companionable proximity for an hour or two before Birch's call brought it back. "Did you ever touch it?" I said. She thought about this carefully. "Once," she said, "year 7. It came close, closer than usual, I don't know why. Something had it unsettled that day, and it put its hand on my knee. Just for a second, the way a child puts its hand on a knee to steady itself when it's sitting near someone. And I put my hand over its hand without thinking, just the reflex of it. And we both went still. And then it pulled its hand back and moved away and didn't come back for 2 weeks." She paused. "I think I startled it," she said. "I don't think it was prepared for me to respond. I think it had been treating me as a kind of fixture, present, reliable, not quite the same category as the others. And the response confused that. After those 2 weeks, it came back and sat the same as always. But it was more cautious for a while. Took a few months to get back to the previous level." I asked her what it looked like now in 2019. She said, "Grown, mostly. Still younger than Birch, I think, but getting close. It's the one that comes to the upper creek most often. I see it more than any of them." "Does it still come to sit with you?" "Sometimes," she said. "Less often. It has its own range now, its own, I don't know, agenda." She almost smiled when she said that. It was the closest thing to a genuine smile I saw from her in 2 hours, and it was directed at the thought of a creature that had grown up alongside her, having its own agenda now. She told me about the sounds. I'd asked about communication earlier, and she'd described gesture and placement and context. But there was another layer she came back to later in the conversation, when we'd been talking long enough, that she seemed more willing to go into things she found hard to describe. The family group had vocalizations that she'd been cataloging in her head since the first year. A vocabulary, if you could call it that, of sounds that were used consistently and that she'd come to understand as distinct categories of meaning. Not translation. She was very clear about this. Not the ability to decode specific meaning from specific sounds, but something more like the ability to know which register of communication was happening. There were sounds that meant something was wrong, sounds that meant a direction, sounds that meant come, sounds that meant stay, sounds that meant the neutral, ongoing presence, signal that she'd come to think of as simply, "I'm here." There were sounds she only heard when the family group was together in the basin at night, sounds that were different in texture from all the others, and that she didn't have a category for, and wasn't going to invent one. The sound that most stayed with her, she described to me carefully. She heard it first in her 6th year, in the deep winter before dawn, a single sustained vocalization from above the shelter, from the direction of the ridge. Very low frequency, held for a long time, a sound that she felt physically before she heard it consciously. She'd been in half sleep, and it brought her fully awake without fear. That was the thing about it, she said. In her body, it didn't read as threat. It read as something else she didn't have a word for. She lay in her shelter and listened to it, and it went on for maybe 2 minutes, and then it stopped, and the silence after it was different from the silence before. She heard it again twice in the following years, both times before dawn, both times in deep winter. The third time she was outside when it started. She'd been up before light for her own reasons and was tending the fire outside the shelter when it began. She stopped moving. It was coming from the ridge above the basin. The Old One's section of territory, she thought, though she couldn't be certain at that distance in the dark. She listened. It went on for 3 or 4 minutes. It filled the basin. She said the pines moved slightly during it, a real physical response in the air, and that afterward one of the goats that sometimes came to the lower section of the territory, a mountain goat that she'd been watching for 2 seasons, stood still on the far slope for a long time before moving on. "What do you think it was?" I said. "I don't know," she said. "I've thought about it a lot. Territorial marker, maybe, but territorial markers among animals tend to be repetitive, and those weren't. It was more like the low vocalizations that whales make, the ones that travel hundreds of miles, the kind of sound you'd make if you needed to be heard at a very large distance." I thought about the range of the family group, the territory she'd described with overlaps into adjacent drainages. I thought about the Mad River country, 2 ridges over, about what else was in those drainages that she might have been hearing announced to. She talked about the 6th year specifically, the year she heard the sound the first time, as the year a lot of things clarified for her. She'd been in the drainage long enough by then that the initial emergency management mode had given way to something she could only describe as residence. The drainage wasn't a place she was surviving in anymore. It was a place she lived. The distinction sounds small. It isn't. In the 6th year, she started keeping a more formal, internal record of the territory. Not just the family group, but the full ecology of the drainage as she experienced it. Bird populations, which she had some academic background to catalog from the Central Washington biology coursework she'd done before nursing school switched her focus. Plant succession patterns in the burn sections from a fire in the 2000s that had taken out a section of the North Slope. The deer movement calendar, which shifted from year to year with the snowpack and the forage availability at different elevations. The creek hydrology, how the spring pulse worked when the side tributaries went dry. She said she kept the record because she needed to, not for any practical survival purpose. Because being a witness to something, she said, is a way of being in relationship with it. She'd grown up in the Entiat Valley, but she'd never known it. Not really. She'd hiked in it and picnicked by the river and driven the valley road 1,000 times and hadn't known it. 6 years in the drainage above it, she knew one small piece of it with a depth that she understood no scientist or ranger or habitat biologist was ever going to know it, because they would always be observing from outside, and she was inside. The knowing was experiential in a way that observation never is. In year 8, she had the encounter with the Old One at closer range than any previous contact. She'd been working the eastern end of the shared section of the basin, a section she used for plant processing in late summer when the fireweed was at its peak, and she was drying the flowers and leaves for winter use. The fireweed, Camerian angustifolium, grows in profusion in burns and disturbed areas at that elevation, and the one she had access to was a thick stand in a section of the 2000s burn that was in the recovery stage. She'd been there for a couple of hours in the afternoon. She'd been aware, at the edges of her awareness, that something was present in the upper timber. Not the guardian, whose presence had a specific quality she could distinguish by that point, This was different, heavier in the particular way that greater age is heavier. She kept working. She didn't look up. After a while, maybe 40 minutes of this presence at the margin, she heard footsteps coming down the slope. Slow, deliberate, not the guardian's pace. Longer stride, more careful foot placement, the gait of something whose joints have learned to work around their own limits. She kept her eyes on her work. The footsteps stopped about 60 feet away. She looked up. The old one was standing at the tree line, partially in shade, looking at her. She had seen it at 100 feet, at 200 feet, in passing glimpses over 8 years. At 60 feet, in the slanted late afternoon light, she could see it clearly. She said it was larger than the guardian, broader at the shoulder but carrying more of its weight low, a heaviness in the chest and upper body that the guardian's build didn't have. Its fur was pale, not white, but a bleached gray, with dark patches through the face and upper arm that might have been different original coloring or might have been what years do to fur. The face was... She stopped on this and started again. The face had a depth of feature that she hadn't seen in the others. Not more expressive, more inhabited. The eyes were the deepest brown she'd seen in any of them, so dark they were nearly black, and they were looking at her with an attention that wasn't the guardian's focused assessment or Birch's lateral curiosity. It was something else. The closest she could come was the attention of something very old, looking at something that has been in its world for long enough to be considered. They looked at each other for a while. Neither moved. Then the old one did something she said she has spent a long time since trying to understand. It raised one hand, slowly, no urgency, and placed it flat against the trunk of the fir at the tree line beside it, held it there for a moment, then lowered it and turned and went back up into the timber. The footsteps receded. The presence faded. She sat there with the fireweed for a long time before she went back to processing it. "What do you think that meant?" I said. "I think it was the introduction," she said, "the one the stone map was predicting. And I was glad it went the way it did," she said. "Has the guardian, have any of them ever been aggressive with you?" I said, "in 15 years. "Once," she said, "year 3. I went into a section of the upper drainage I hadn't been before, and I didn't read the signs right. I should have turned back earlier. When I didn't, one of the others, not the guardian, one of the others I didn't know as well, came down off the slope fast and got close, very close, and made a sound I'd never heard before. I ran." She paused. "I learned a lot from that about what territorial means when the territory is actually defended. And afterward? Afterward, I stayed out of that section for 2 years," she said. "And then one day, the guardian took me up there, led me, essentially. And I understood that something had changed, season or time or, I don't know. Permission is the closest word I have, and I know it's not quite right." I looked up the slope again. The shape in the timber had, at some point while Carla was talking, settled. It seemed lower, and the particular quality of its stillness had shifted from the watchful, upright stillness of before to something more like repose, not inattentive, but less actively alert, the way an animal settles when it's decided the situation is stable. I thought about that. About the decision being made by what was up the slope about this conversation, this morning, this ranger who had found the pack. "You said it decided to let you see me," I said. "What does that mean exactly, to you?" Carla was quiet for a moment. "When things come into the territory that aren't part of the territory," she said slowly, "they know. before I know, usually. The Guardian, especially. It will move to a position before whatever it's responding to is close enough for me to hear. I've watched it do this hundreds of times. Whatever sense or set of senses it's using, it's running well ahead of anything I can do. And it placed itself where I could see it if I looked, I said. Yes. That's unusual. In 15 years, she said, the only people who've come into this drainage, 3 of them, have left not knowing anything was there. The Guardian has not placed itself where any of them could see it. I turned this over. So why today? I said. I don't know, she said. I really don't. I've been thinking about it since you found the pack. Maybe it was the pack. Maybe the pack being found. The name on it, what that means. Maybe that changed something. I thought about what it would mean if the pack had drawn my attention down from the trail and brought me into the trees, and the Guardian had watched that happen and made a decision. Some chain of consequence in which the name on an old pack was the pivot point, the thing that made this morning different from every other morning a person had come up this trail in 11 years. And I thought about something Carla had said earlier, about how they know where things are before she does. The pack had been hanging from that branch for 15 years. The Guardian had known it was there. The Guardian had watched 3 other people come up that trail, and none of them had gone off trail toward it. This morning I had, and the Guardian had watched me find it and find the name and reach for the radio and stop myself, and then it had let me see it. I wasn't sure what to make of that sequence. I still aren't, fully. But I had the sense, sitting on that slope, that the morning had been more observed than I'd understood. I said, I need to tell you something about the radio. She looked at me. I'm going to call this in, I said. I don't see a way around it. A missing person from 15 years ago is alive. I don't have the authority to sit on that. I don't have the right. Her face didn't change, exactly, but something in it settled, the way the Guardian had settled. A resignation that had probably been somewhere near the surface of this conversation from the beginning. I know, she said. I knew you were going to say that. But I want to tell you what I'm going to say, I said. I'm going to report that I encountered a woman in the Crow Creek drainage who identified herself as Carla Freely. I'm going to report that she appears to be in good health and is present in the backcountry by her own choice. I'm going to report her location as the lower Crow Creek drainage, approximately 4 miles from the trailhead. That's all I'm going to report. She looked at me carefully. Nothing else, I said. No description of the cache location. No, I'm not going to describe anything else I found or encountered today. I'm going to give them you, your name, your condition, your approximate location, and then I'm going to let you tell them whatever you decide to tell them. They'll want to search the area, she said. Probably, I said. That's going to be up to you to manage. I can't stop them from putting a search team in here, and I won't lie about terrain or access conditions to discourage it. But I'm not going to hand them anything beyond the minimum. She was quiet for a long moment. What made you decide that? She said. I looked up the slope. I saw the pack and thought about the search, I said. I thought about what a search of this drainage would produce. I know this drainage. I know what's up there. Or I thought I did before today. I paused. I don't want to be responsible for what happens if a search team finds something that turns a missing person's recovery into something else. That's the honest answer. She nodded once. And after today, she said, what happens to you? I go back to work, I said. I write the report. I get debriefed because this is going to be a significant case by any measure. And then I come back to work and I do my job. In this district, I said, for however long I'm here. She understood what I meant by that. She was quiet for another moment, and then she said, "You're going to come back up this trail." "Probably," I said. "Trail conditions checks are quarterly. This section is on my rotation." "I know," she said. Of course she did. She'd watched the ranger who did this section for 11 years. She'd watched me for 8. "When I come up this trail," I said, "I'm going to be doing my job. I'm not going to be looking for things that aren't in my job description." She almost smiled. It was a complicated expression. That's very carefully worded. "I'm a careful person," I said. "I've noticed," she said. There was a pause, a longer one than the others. The creek was loud in it. A Douglas squirrel went off somewhere in the firs above, that rapid chittering alarm call, and then stopped. "One more thing," Carla said, "while I'm here." I waited. "The old one," she said. "The very old one I mentioned, the one I never named." "Yes." "It's been in the upper drainage my whole time here. 15 years. I've seen it maybe 40 times, always from a distance, always on its own, always moving slowly. It has not once come to the section of the drainage where I live, not once acknowledged me that I could observe." "Okay," I said. "About 4 years ago, it started coming closer," she said. "Not to my area, but to the edge of the shared section, the section where the Guardian and Birch and the young one come. It would be there sometimes when I was there, maybe 100 feet off, in the trees, not doing anything, not looking at me, exactly, but present. And 2 years ago it left something," she said. "In the shared section. I found it in the morning, set on a flat rock I use as a work surface. A piece of granite, flattened on one side, palm-sized. There was a mark on the flat side, something scratched into it. I've looked at it a lot, and I think it's a map. Or something like a map. The drainage, I think, and some features I can recognize. A ridgeline, a bend in the creek. And in the section I'd call the upper basin, where the old one moves, there are marks I can't read, marks I haven't seen anywhere in the territory." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you make of it?" I said. "I think it's an introduction," she said. "I think it's been deciding for 15 years whether to introduce itself, and I think 2 years ago it decided." I sat with that. "Have you gone to the upper basin?" "Not yet," she said. "The Guardian goes there. It doesn't bring me, but it hasn't indicated I shouldn't go either." "When you do," I said. "When I do," she said, "I'll know more than I know now." The conversation with Carla lasted close to 2 hours on that slope. When I finally stood up and started getting my gear together, the shape in the timber above had been gone for a while. I wasn't sure exactly when it had left. The smell had faded to almost nothing. The drainage felt like just a drainage again. The creek sound and the wind and the particular kind of quiet that is its own kind of fullness. Carla stood up when I did, and we faced each other for a moment. "The pack," she said. "Leave it," I said. "It's your gear. If it's helpful to you, leave it there. If it's not, do what you want with it." She nodded. "Your mother," I said. "I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure she knows you're alive. I can't control the rest of it, but she's going to know." Carla looked at the ground for a moment, and when she looked back up, her face was doing something complicated that I recognized as a person holding something in that wants very much to come out. The particular expression of someone who made a hard choice long ago and has never stopped carrying the weight of it. "Thank you," she said. "I'm going to the ridge now to get a signal. I said. "You probably have somewhere you want to be." "Yes," she said. I started down the slope toward the trail. I got maybe 30 feet and stopped and turned. "One question," I said. "The last one." She waited. "The Guardian, that first time, when it found you in the drainage when you were injured. What do you think it was doing? What was the decision it made?" She thought about this for a while. "I think it saw something in distress," she said, "and it had a choice about what to do with that. I think those two things, the distress and the choice, are things it has been acquainted with for a very long time, longer than I can understand, and I think it made the choice it makes when it decides a thing is worth its time." She paused. "I don't know why it decided I was worth its time. I've thought about that for 15 years, and I don't have an answer." "Do you need one?" I said. "No," she said, after a moment. "I guess I don't." I turned and went back to the trail and walked north to the 6-mile mark, where the elevation cleared the ridge to the west, and my radio found the repeater. I called in at 11:47 in the morning. The dispatcher put me on hold for 40 seconds and came back with a supervisor who asked me to repeat what I'd said. I repeated it, then she put the supervisor on hold and came back with the district ranger who asked me to stay on the line. I gave them Carla's name, physical description, approximate location, and health assessment. I said she appeared to be in good health and was in the drainage by voluntary choice. I said she was not in distress and did not require emergency medical evacuation. I said I had spoken with her at length and she was lucid, coherent, and capable of informed decision-making. I said she was aware of my report and had indicated she would be willing to speak with authorities. I did not mention the pack. I did not mention the smell, the shape in the timber, the stillness, the 2 hours on the slope. I did not mention any of those things, and none of them were asked about, and they are not in the report I submitted later that day. The walk back to the truck took me about 3 hours. I didn't push it. I had a lot to do with my head on the way down, and walking slowly gave me time to do it. I thought about the 2004 search first, about Gabe Lindquist and his 11 days, and the cadaver dogs, and the sector he'd flagged as incomplete. I thought about the afternoon of day 4, when the creek had been running high, and a SAR team had been shouting Carla's name into a drainage where a young woman with broken ribs and a sprained ankle was lying 30 feet below them, listening to them not hear her. I thought about the gap between what happened and what the record said happened, and how those two things had been running parallel for 15 years in this valley with nobody bridging them. I thought about the Guardian, about a thing that had been in that drainage for, what? How long? Not 15 years, much longer than 15 years. I thought about what Carla had said about the old one, the one she'd never named, and about the depth of feature in its face, and about what it means to have a face like that, a face that has accumulated something rather than simply existed. I have seen faces like that in very old people sometimes. The quality is real. It's not metaphor. Something genuine accumulates in a face over decades of experience. I thought about the decision the Guardian had made when it found Carla in the creek drainage, a 19-year-old girl, injured and afraid, alone below a ledge in a rainstorm, with the search already in the drainage above her. The choice it made: come closer, check her, feed her, not exploit vulnerability, feed it. I've spent 16 years working in a region where black bears are numerous, and in some years their interaction with humans skews toward predatory when conditions are right. A bear will read an injured human in a remote drainage the same way it reads an injured deer, which is to say, as an opportunity. Whatever was in that drainage when Carla was injured read it differently. Brought food, came back, sat nearby, waited. I thought about the long patience of that choice, the 15-year patience of it. The way the family group had absorbed the presence of a human in their territory, not as threat or prey, but as something that fit a different category, something that required a different kind of response, and had maintained that response through years and seasons without revision. I thought through the report, exactly what I would say, what words I would use, what I would omit. I thought about the legal implications of my omissions, which I have a clearer sense of than most people because I have a law enforcement commission and I know where the lines are. What I was omitting was not evidence of a crime. What I was omitting was personal observation about a situation that Carla herself would characterize to the authorities, however she chose to characterize it. My report would be accurate. It would be incomplete. There is a space between those two things that I had spent a career living in. The space between what you observed and what belongs in an official record. And I knew how to inhabit that space without it compromising my integrity. At least that's what I told myself on the walk down. I got back to the truck at 3 p.m. I sat in it for a while before I drove. The Entiat Valley was hot at that elevation in July, the sun off the river road bright enough to make me squint, even with the visor down. Normal afternoon, normal summer. I'd driven this road probably 1,000 times. I drove back to the station and sat at my desk and wrote the incident report. Took me about 40 minutes. I read it over 3 times. Every sentence was accurate. I filed it. Then I drove to the Texaco at the junction of the Entiat River Road and Highway 97A, which is where I get gas and where the owner, a man named Boyd Sellers, who has been there since before I moved to the district, keeps a decent sandwich cooler in the back. I bought a turkey sandwich and a Gatorade and sat in the parking lot and ate. Boyd waved at me from behind the counter. Normal Tuesday. The Chelan County Sheriff's Office sent a team up Crow Creek 2 days later. I know this because I was asked to accompany them as the district ranger who knew the terrain. The team consisted of 2 detectives, a SAR coordinator, and a county victims advocate. We walked the 4 miles in, and I showed them the general area of the slope where I'd been when I encountered Carla. The 2 detectives were Wenatchee-based, which meant Eastern Cascades experience, but not specifically the Entiat country. The SAR coordinator was a woman named Paulette Sue, who I'd worked with on 2 previous searches in the district, and who had, in my estimation, better judgment in the field than most of the sworn personnel she worked alongside. The victim's advocate, Trudy Elko, was from county services and was clearly not a backcountry person. She was adequately equipped and she didn't complain, but she was watching the terrain the way people watch terrain that doesn't match anything in their experience, with a specific kind of alertness that's also a specific kind of not knowing what to look for. Carla was not there. The team spent 4 hours in the drainage. They found some physical sign I'll describe in a moment, but no person. I was not surprised. I had, in the 2 days between my call and the search team's arrival, spent some time thinking about what Carla would do with 48 hours of notice, and I had concluded that she'd use them well. She knew that drainage better than I did, better than any of us did. Finding her in it when she didn't want to be found would have been, practically speaking, impossible. The physical sign the team found was this: boot prints in the soil near a small spring off the main trail at roughly the 3-mile mark, consistent with a woman of Carla's height and build based on the stride length and depth. A primitive camp site of sorts, enough to confirm occupation of the area over an extended period. The pack, hanging from the branch above the fir cluster where I'd found it, which the victim's advocate identified from a photograph the Freely family had provided to law enforcement years before. The detectives asked me several questions on the walk back out. Were there any other structures in the drainage above the 3-mile mark? No structures I'd observed that were inconsistent with natural feature. Any evidence of other individuals in the area? No. Had the woman I spoke with mentioned anyone else? She'd spoken about living in the drainage for an extended period and about her general state of health. Was there anything in the encounter that had raised concern for her safety or welfare? No. I answered every one of those questions accurately. Paulette Sue fell into step with me on the last mile out, the two of us ahead of the detectives and the advocate. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she said, quietly enough that it didn't carry, "This is a strange one." "Missing persons cases are usually strange," I said. "Not like this," she said. I didn't respond to that directly. She didn't push it. We walked out. 3 weeks after my radio call, Carla Freely made contact with the Chelan County Sheriff's Office by presenting herself, in person, at the county office in Wenatchee. I know this from a call I received from Trudy Elko, who'd been with us on the drainage search. She called to let me know and to thank me for the initial report. She said Carla was physically healthy, had been assessed by a physician and cleared of any immediate medical concerns. She said Carla had given a statement describing a period of isolation following an accidental injury, living off the land in the Crow Creek drainage, and a decision not to return to public life that she had maintained for 15 years and was now revising. She said the statement did not include anything that contradicted my report. Trudy Elko said something else at the end of that call. She said, "She keeps saying she wants to go back. She's cooperating with everything, but she keeps saying she needs to go back. Is there something up there I should know about? Something you didn't put in the report?" I said, "There's a lot of country up there and she knows it well. If she wants to go back, I think that's consistent with what I observed. A person who's built a life in a place generally wants to return to it." There was a pause on the line. "Is she safe up there?" Trudy said. "In my assessment," I said, "yes." Another pause. "Okay," she said, and I could hear in it the same thing I felt when I'd made the decision on the slope. Not satisfaction exactly, not comfort, but a kind of alignment. The feeling of having done the thing that needed to be done, in a situation where the thing that needed to be done was not simple. Carla went back. I don't know the exact timeline of when or how that was arranged, what she told the county, what conditions were placed on her, how the legal situation around a 15-year absence resolved itself. Those things were not in my lane. I do know that Carla met with her mother. I know this because Trudy Elko called me once more, about 6 weeks after Carla came into the county office and told me that the family reunion had happened, and that it had been, in her assessment, as good as it could be. She said Carla's mother had not left the meeting easily. She said some things were said that were difficult on both sides. She said Carla had cried, which Trudy seemed to feel was significant, and which I took to mean it was the first time Carla had cried in front of another person in a very long time. She said Carla had promised to come down again before winter. Whether she kept that promise, I don't know. What I know is that by the fall of that year, when I was doing the September condition check on Crow Creek Trail, the signs of recent occupation I'd observed near the 3-mile spring were consistent with active use. I noted it in my trail condition report as animal activity. I have done the Crow Creek Trail condition check 8 times since that morning in July of 2019. I've done it in all 4 seasons now, which means I've been up that drainage in snow and mud, and the particular dense stillness of midsummer, when the forest in those elevations holds heat in a way it doesn't at lower elevation, everything suspended and thick and close. I have not seen Carla again. I have not spoken to her. I have, on 3 of those 8 checks, been aware of something in the timber that I was not able to identify. Once it was a smell, the layered smell I described, earthy and animal on top. Something green underneath, the sweetness at the back of the throat. Once it was a sound, high in the drainage, probably 600 or 700 feet above me on the ridge, a vocalization that I can only describe by saying it was clearly not any bird and not any sound from the standard wildlife I know in that country. A low, resonant call that repeated twice and stopped. And once, on a morning in early April 2 years ago, I was in the open section of the trail near the 4-mile mark, the section where the trail widens on a south-facing bench with good sight lines in multiple directions, and I stopped to eat the sandwich I'd brought. And I had the specific, particular, non-negotiable feeling of being watched. I didn't look into the timber. I ate my sandwich. I checked the trail surface for frost heave damage and documented a section of tread that needed repair. I wrote it up in my notes. I have thought, on those 3 occasions, about something Carla said in passing during our conversation on the slope. She'd mentioned that she sometimes knew the guardian was in a section of the drainage before she heard or saw anything. A feeling she'd learned to trust over years, a specific quality of attention that she recognized as coming from somewhere outside herself. She said it carefully and didn't try to explain the mechanism, just described what she experienced. I thought I understood that as she described it. I understand it differently now. I am a person who deals in observable fact. My training is biological and practical and law enforcement, not inclined toward claims that don't have physical grounding. So when I tell you that on those 3 occasions in the Crow Creek drainage I knew I was being observed before I heard or smelled anything, I want to be clear that I'm describing a subjective experience and not making a factual claim. I'm describing what happened in my body, a shift in the quality of attention, a kind of localization without a source, the specific knowledge that something was watching from the timber above me. And I'm also telling you that 2 of those 3 times, when I eventually smelled the smell or heard the sound, it was coming from exactly the direction that the knowledge in my body had indicated. One of those times, there was nothing. I felt it, sat with it, finished the sandwich, walked on, nothing. The drainage was empty, as far as I could tell. Maybe that was a false positive. Maybe I was primed to feel something after the previous 2 times. Or maybe whatever was up there decided I'd been observed long enough and left without confirming itself. I don't know which of those things is true. I'm not sure I need to. When I got back to my truck at the trailhead, I sat for a moment with the engine off. I thought about what Carla had said when I asked her why the guardian had decided I could see it. The way she'd said she didn't know, and the way she'd said it that made me think she had a theory, even if she wasn't certain of it, and had chosen not to share it. I've thought about that unanswered thing a lot in the years since. The gap in the answer, what goes in the gap. The most honest thing I can tell you is this. I have spent 16 years in some of the most remote backcountry in the North Cascades, country that very few people know well, and that most people couldn't survive in for more than a few days. In those 16 years, I have developed a particular kind of relationship with that country. Not ownership, not mastery, but something more like mutual acknowledgement. I know what belongs there and what doesn't. I know the sounds and the smells and the movements and the presences. I know when something is different. On July 14th, 2019, something was different. I carry that morning with me the way I carry all the significant mornings from 16 years in those drainages. The injury rescues, the body recoveries, the times the weather turned faster than it should have, the moments where the margin got thin. The job accumulates in you over time as a kind of knowledge that's partly learned and partly absorbed, the way the terrain absorbs water. Slowly, without announcement, until one day you look at a slope and know what it's going to do in a storm without having to calculate it. The knowledge from that morning is different from the other knowledge. It doesn't sit in the same part. It's somewhere deeper, less categorical, more like the knowledge of a smell than the knowledge of a fact. I still work the Entiat District. I'm still on the Crow Creek rotation. There are things in those drainages that I am not going to put in a report. There are things in the backcountry of the North Cascades that do not belong to any category I have professional authority over, and that I have decided, in the way that people make decisions about things they cannot control and cannot fully understand, to leave in the category of the territory's own business. I have thought about Carla Freely's decision on the day she stood at the trail junction, looking down toward the town of Entiat, with the guardian somewhere at the tree line behind her. I've thought about what she weighed and what she chose. I've thought about whether I would have made the same choice, and concluded honestly that I don't know. I have not had 15 years in that drainage. I have not had the winter of the 5th year, or the illness of the 12th year, or any of the mornings she described in those 2 hours on the slope. I have not had someone place 2 fingers on my face in a creek drainage when I was at my lowest and walk away without asking for anything in return. What I have had is 1 morning, 1 slope, 1 conversation, and the smell coming down off the ridge with the north wind that I know now I'd smelled twice before without knowing what it was. The layered smell, earthy and animal and green and sweet and old. I know what it is now. I don't go looking for it. But on mornings when the wind comes, right, when I'm in the upper sections of Crow Creek in the early light, in the old timber above the 5-mile mark where the canopy is still dense enough to hold the moisture from the night, sometimes the wind brings it, and when it does, I stop. I stand still. I do what any sensible person